Okay, we're on Chapter 2, Video 6. We're talking now about the First Amendment and religion. And the First Amendment Free Exercise Clause guarantees a person's right to freely exercise his or her religion. Employers have to reasonably accommodate a sincerely held belief by their employees, and the government cannot act, but the government can act in protecting the public where religious practices work against public policy and welfare. So, for example, forcing a child to get a blood transfusion that their parents may object to. Okay, so there are two parts to the First Amendment freedom of religion. One part is called the Free Exercise Clause, and the other is the Establishment Clause. So the Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a state-sponsored religion or passing laws that favor one over the other. So this is probably the bedrock of what the court has used to rule prayer in school to be unconstitutional. Now, with regard to establishment and practice, the government action must not place a substantial burden on a just practice of religion. It's considered substantial if it pressures an individual to modify his or her behavior and violate his or her beliefs. Okay. So that's a quick look at religion. Okay, the Second Amendment deals, as you know, with the right to bear arms. The language of it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, as you may be aware, the main case dealing with the Second Amendment is the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, which is now, about 7 to 10 years old. Prior to that, even though people don't really believe or understand this, there was significant debate over whether the Second Amendment protected an individual's right to a gun. And that was because of the language you see here, a well-regulated militia, which was interpreted by many people to mean that your right to bear arms was only as a part of being a militia. However, the Supreme Court in Heller interpreted the Second Amendment to mean that individuals have a right to arms to a certain degree. Now, the language of the opinion makes it clear that this is not an absolute right. We talked about all the rights not being absolute. And that the government can place some restrictions on the right to bear arms, such as the type of weapons that a person can have. So it's possible and likely in the future that there will be cases that address the issue of things like assault rifles, guns that can hold multiple bullets, different types of bullets maybe even, and maybe going as far as things like bazookas, nuclear weapons, etc. And maybe where you can have the guns, like a restriction on bringing guns into, for example, a hospital maybe, or the Congress. So those things are yet to be determined. Okay, the Fourth Amendment, which we'll be talking a lot more about when we talk about criminal law and criminal procedure, has to do with searches and seizures, and it basically says that in order to search and seize a person's property, the government must first have a probable cause, and in many instances a warrant. And the warrant has to be based upon probable cause. These search warrants that are issued by the court have to be specific. General searches through personal belongings are illegal. Generally, business inspectors must have a warrant, though warrantless searches are permissible for seizures of certain items like spoiled or contaminated food. So it's not absolute in that area. Alright, so we'll get into a lot more with regard to that when we talk about criminal law. Self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment guarantees that a person cannot be compelled to testify against themselves. It does not extend to corporations or partnerships. Again, it's not absolute. For example, you probably have seen stories like this on TV. If the government offers you immunity from prosecution, then since you can't be prosecuted, you're not in jeopardy. So the Fifth Amendment would not apply in a situation like that. Okay, also under the Fifth Amendment we have a due process right. It's covered in the Fifth Amendment as well as the 14th Amendment. Remember, the first 10 amendments only apply as against the federal government, and the 14th Amendment applies as against the states. So regardless of whether it is the state or the federal government that may be impinging on your due process rights, you're covered because of both the 5th and the 14th Amendment. And it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay? Now, due process has two components. There's a substantive due process and a procedural due process. Procedural due process means that the government, before they can take your life, liberty, or property, has to give you an opportunity to be heard and to state your side of the matter. And it's a lot more involved than that. We'll get into some of that later. Substantive due process, which at one point when I was in law school was considered not to exist anymore because of Supreme Court decisions, is now alive and well again. And it basically says that there are certain rights that we have, like the right to travel, that are protected by due process. So the government cannot deny you the right to travel without possibly being in violation of due process and the court striking down that particular law. Fair procedures must be used in determining whether a person will be subject to punishment or have some burden imposed upon him. Okay, so when the government is taking your personal liberty, certain rules apply. When they're taking your property, certain rules apply. So you first have to have a property interest in what the government is taking. Once that is established, then the government has to pay you just and fair compensation and provide you with an opportunity to be heard and present your side of the case. So a typical situation would be where the local government wants to take some of your property along the front of your residence in order to expand the road, to make it more lanes. In this situation, the government has to pay you fair compensation and has to provide you due process. So if the government offers you $10,000 and you believe it's worth $25,000, then you have the right to go through due process, including ultimately a court hearing, and have a court decide what just compensation you should get. Okay. So as we said, substantive due process focuses on the content of the legislation, that is the right itself, instead of the process or the fairness of the process. Okay, so what are some of the fundamental rights that are protected by substantive due process? As I said, the right to travel, the right to privacy, voting, marriage, family, and all First Amendment rights. In order for a state to impinge upon those rights, the state must have a substantial reason for taking any action that violates your fundamental rights. Okay, we're going to stop there and we'll pick back up in the next video with equal protection under the 14th Amendment.